Ethan Hayes was a man carved from the harsh landscape of the West, his face a roadmap of sun and sorrow. Harmony Creek, the small settlement he called home, mirrored his own quiet resilience, a place where the wind carried whispers of both hardship and hope. For years, since the fever stole his Sarah, Ethan had lived a life etched in routine, the rhythm of his ranch a solitary comfort. He'd seen his share of hopeful arrivals and bitter departures, but the stir caused by Ilara Vance was different. She arrived like a fragile wildflower in a field of tough prairie grass, her beauty a stark contrast to the weathered faces and calloused hands of the townsfolk. There was a shadow in her eyes, a guardedness in her posture that spoke of burdens carried in silence. The whispers followed her like dust devils, tales spun from rumor and innuendo, painting her past with broad strokes of judgment. Yet, in her quiet dignity, Ethan saw a flicker of something familiar, a vulnerability that resonated with the ache in his own heart. The day of Ilara's intended wedding dawned hot and unforgiving, the air thick with anticipation and something darker. Ethan stood at the edge of the small crowd, gathered outside the church, his gaze distant, the echoes of his own wedding day a bittersweet pang in his chest. The scene that unfolded was brutal in its public condemnation. As the groom, a man with a cruel glint in his eyes and a sneer on his lips, publicly denounced Ilara, his accusations sharp and laced with malice, a collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Ilara stood there, her face pale but her spine straight, absorbing the venomous words like blows. The humiliation was palpable, a stain spreading across the dusty ground. In that moment of raw exposure, as the townsfolk averted their eyes or whispered amongst themselves, something shifted within Ethan. He saw not a woman defined by her past, but a soul stripped bare and left to the wolves. An impulse, swift and uncharacteristic, surged through him. Ignoring the stunned silence and the judging stares, Ethan moved through the crowd, his boots crunching on the parched earth. He reached Ilara as the discarded groom stormed away, leaving her standing alone in the swirling dust of her ruined hopes. Without a word, his gaze steady and offering a silent understanding, Ethan extended his hand. His calloused fingers, weathered by years of honest labor, waited for hers. The air crackled with disbelief. Ilara looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock, confusion, and a desperate flicker of hope. In that raw and exposed moment, with the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on her, she placed her trembling hand in his. "Ilara Vance," Ethan said, his voice firm and clear, cutting through the murmurs. "Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The question hung in the air, audacious and unexpected. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk. Ilara's breath hitched, tears welling in her eyes, but there was a newfound strength in her gaze as she met Ethan's. In the face of public scorn and utter desolation, a flicker of defiance ignited within her. With a fragile nod and a voice barely above a whisper, she answered, "Yes, Mr. Hayes, I will. That very afternoon, under the vast and indifferent sky of the western frontier, the unlikely pair stood before the bewildered town, bound together not by love's gentle promise, but by an act of profound compassion and a shared defiance against the unforgiving judgment of man. The initial days of their marriage were a landscape of unspoken anxieties and tentative steps. Ethan's ranch house, once filled with the comfortable silence of solitude, tinged with the memory of Sarah, now echoed with the unfamiliar presence of Ilara. They moved around each other with a careful politeness, strangers bound by a sudden and unconventional vow. The townsfolk of Harmony Creek remained a formidable barrier, their whispers following Ilara like shadows, their glances sharp with suspicion. Ethan felt their disapproval, the subtle shift in conversations when he approached, the coolness in the eyes of men he had known for years. Yet he stood by his decision, a quiet stubbornness hardening his resolve. He had offered Ilara a refuge, a chance at a new beginning, and he would not waver in his commitment. Ilara carried herself with a quiet dignity, despite the weight of the town's scorn. She took on the tasks of the household with a quiet efficiency. Her hands, though delicate, were capable. She cooked simple meals, her movements economical and graceful, filling the house with aromas Ethan hadn't realized he'd missed. Their conversations were sparse, often centered on the practicalities of daily life, the needs of the livestock, the state of the crops, the weather. Yet in these small exchanges, Ethan began to glimpse the woman beneath the layers of shame the town had draped around her. He saw her resilience in the face of adversity, her quiet strength as she met his gaze without flinching, and a flicker of warmth that hinted at a spirit not entirely broken. Despite the external pressures, a fragile sense of normalcy began to settle within the walls of the ranch house. Ethan found a quiet comfort in Ilara's presence during their shared meals, in the way she tended to the small patch of wildflowers she found near the creek, a splash of color in the otherwise muted landscape. He started sharing small details of his day, the stubbornness of a particular mule, the promising signs of rain. Ilara, in turn, would offer a shy smile or a thoughtful observation. These were small gestures, but they were the first tentative threads of connection being woven between them. However, the unspoken questions lingered in the air. Ilara carried the burden of her past like a physical weight, and Ethan, though compassionate, knew little of the specifics that had led to her public shaming. He respected her silence, sensing that the time for sharing would come when she was ready. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows that clung to her would eventually reach their door, threatening the fragile peace they were beginning to build. Their marriage, born not of affection but of circumstance, was a delicate structure, and the winds of the past threatened to tear it down before it had a chance to truly stand. The fragile equilibrium they had begun to establish was shattered by the arrival of Silas Thorne. A man with a swagger and a cruel smile, he rode into Harmony Creek like a storm cloud, his eyes immediately finding Ilara. His taunts were loud and public, dredging up the details of her past, twisting them into scandalous accusations that reignited the town's prejudice with renewed fervor. Ilara, who had begun to tentatively emerge from her shell, retreated once more, the shame in her eyes a painful mirror of the judgment surrounding her. Ethan watched, his jaw tight, the protective instinct he felt for this woman, his wife, rising fiercely within him. He had offered her his name and his home, and he would be damned if he allowed this snake to poison the sanctuary he had provided. Silas's presence was a constant torment, his whispers following Ilara even within the confines of their ranch. He made veiled threats to Ethan, insinuating that he was a fool for taking in damaged goods. The tension in the small house became palpable, the weight of the external hostility pressing down on them. Ethan, a man of action rather than words, found his patience wearing thin. He confronted Silas in the town's dusty street, the exchange terse and charged with unspoken violence. Ethan made it clear that Ilara was under his protection, his quiet authority carrying a weight that even Silas seemed reluctant to fully challenge. Yet the encounter left a lingering unease, a sense that this was only the beginning. Faced with the renewed hostility of the town and the direct threat from Silas, Ilara finally began to speak of her past. Her voice was low and hesitant at first, each word a painful admission. She recounted a story of betrayal and manipulation, of circumstances beyond her control that had led to her ruin. Ethan listened in silence, his heart aching at the injustice she had endured. He saw the raw pain in her eyes, the years of carrying a burden that was not entirely hers. As she spoke, the walls between them seemed to crumble, replaced by a shared understanding and a growing sense of solidarity. He realized that his impulsive act of marriage had inadvertently given her a space where she finally felt safe enough to speak her truth. The revelation of Ilara's past, spoken in the quiet intimacy of their home, forged a new bond between them. Ethan's compassion deepened into respect for her resilience, for her courage in the face of such adversity. He vowed to protect her, not just from Silas Thorne, but from the lingering judgment of the town. Together, they began to face the outside world, Ethan's unwavering support a shield against the harsh whispers and condemning glances. The fight for their future had begun, not as individuals bound by circumstance, but as a couple united against the shadows of yesterday, determined to build a life free from the shackles of past injustices. The shared ordeal of confronting Silas and the town's prejudice had unexpectedly drawn Ethan and Ilara closer. The initial awkwardness of their forced union began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet understanding and a growing comfort in each other's presence. They found solace in the simple routines of ranch life, working side by side, their movements becoming more synchronized, their silences less strained. Ethan would often catch Ilara watching him as he worked, a soft expression in her eyes that he couldn't quite decipher, but found himself drawn to. He, in turn, noticed the small acts of kindness she extended. A cup of cool water brought to him in the midday sun, a carefully mended tear in his worn jacket. As they spent more time together, they began to share glimpses of their pasts beyond the immediate circumstances that had brought them together. Ethan spoke of Sarah, not with the heavy grief that had once consumed him, but with a gentle fondness, sharing anecdotes of her laughter and her dreams. Ilara, in turn, spoke of her childhood, of a simpler time before the shadows had fallen. Revealing a spirit that was inherently kind and hopeful, they discovered shared passions for the land, for the quiet beauty of the sunsets, and a mutual appreciation for the resilience of life in the harsh West. These shared moments, these glimpses into each other's souls, began to weave a tapestry of connection that went beyond mere obligation. One evening, a fierce thunderstorm rolled through Harmony Creek, the wind howling like a banshee and the rain lashing against the windows. A tree near the barn was struck by lightning, and without hesitation, Ethan rushed out into the storm. Ilara, fear for him etched on her face, followed close behind. Working together in the driving rain, they managed to secure the panicked animals and prevent further damage. In the midst of the chaos and the shared danger, a profound connection sparked between them. Ethan saw the courage in Ilara's eyes, her unwavering determination to help, and Ilara witnessed Ethan's selfless bravery and his unwavering commitment to his land and his animals. That night, huddled by the fire as the storm subsided, a comfortable silence settled between them. Ethan reached out and gently took Ilara's hand, his calloused fingers finding hers. There were no grand pronouncements, no dramatic declarations, but in that simple touch, a silent acknowledgement passed between them. The marriage that had begun as an act of compassion and defiance had slowly, unexpectedly, begun to blossom into something deeper. They were two souls who had found solace and strength in each other amidst the harsh realities of the West, two kindred spirits who had found a flicker of love in the most unlikely of circumstances. The lingering threat of Silas Thorne finally came to a head. Emboldened by the town's continued suspicion of Ilara, he confronted them one last time, his accusations escalating, his intentions clearly malicious. This time, however, Ethan and Ilara stood together, their bond forged in shared adversity. Ethan's quiet strength and Ilara's newfound confidence formed an unyielding front. The townsfolk, witnessing their unity and sensing the injustice of Silas's relentless harassment, began to waver in their judgment. A few brave voices spoke up in Ilara's defense, recalling acts of kindness she had shown despite their coldness, questioning the validity of Silas's bitter claims. The climax arrived not with a violent confrontation, but with the arrival of a witness from Ilara's past, a woman who knew the truth of the circumstances that had led to Ilara's tarnished reputation. Her testimony, delivered with quiet conviction, exposed Silas's lies and exonerated Ilara, revealing him to be a man driven by his own resentments and false accusations. The shift in the town's demeanor was palpable. Shame washed over those who had readily believed the worst, and a sense of remorse filled the air. They saw Ilara not as a woman defined by her past, but as someone who had endured hardship with grace and resilience. In the aftermath, Harmony Creek began to heal. Apologies were offered, hesitant at first, but growing in sincerity. Ethan and Ilara found themselves no longer outcasts, but respected members of the community. The warmth that had been absent for so long began to return to their interactions with their neighbors. They continued to work their ranch, their partnership deepening with each passing day, the initial obligation of their marriage having blossomed into a genuine and tender love. They found comfort in the quiet evenings spent on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky with hues of orange and purple, their hands clasped together. The future that stretched before them was not without its challenges, for life in the West remained unpredictable. But now they faced it together, their love a sturdy foundation built on compassion, resilience, and a shared journey through hardship. Ilara's eyes, once filled with shadows, now held a light of hope and a deep affection for the man who had seen beyond her past and offered her a chance at a new beginning. Ethan, who had thought his heart had closed forever with Sarah's passing, found it opened again in the most unexpected way. As they looked out at the horizon, the vast expanse of the American West seemed less daunting, filled instead with the promise of a shared life, built on the unlikely foundation of dust, disgrace, and a love that had blossomed against all odds.